Hi everyone. I don't know how many of you are here because I cannot see the chat. So I will ask Julia or someone else to interrupt me if you have any questions, or you can feel free to interrupt me at any time to ask any questions. And also at the end, we can see some other questions if you may have any. But for now, we can start. So today we are going to be reviewing Chinese 101, the basics of Chinese and why you should give learning Chinese a chance. So for a little bit of context, as a lot of you may already know, my number one passion is singing. However, I recently found out that I also have a passion for teaching. And I have been a language teacher for the past 2 years, and I still continue doing it as a hobby. So that is why I decided to give you a small introduction to one of the most important and often misunderstood languages in the world. So in this smart hour, my goal will be to teach you the basics of how the Chinese language works and show you that it isn't as difficult as you may think. Don't get me wrong, it is not an easy language, but I believe that by understanding its basics, you may feel a little bit less intimidated by it. And hopefully by the end of the presentation, at least one of you will feel inspired to learn more about this incredible language. And so let's begin. Why learn Chinese, first of all? So Chinese is the second most spoken language in the world. As you can see in this small graph, Chinese is the second most widely spoken language in the world with approximately 1.1 billion speakers, which represents about 14.6% of the global population. Also, many countries apart from China speak Chinese, such as Malaysia, Taiwan, Singapore, Indonesia, Thailand, Brunei, Philippines, Mongolia, and probably others that I'm not remembering. And so by learning Chinese, you could most likely travel and communicate in these countries. Additionally, a lot of stores in popular Asian countries such as Japan and Korea often have an employee who speaks Chinese and not English. In fact, it is difficult to find someone who speaks fluent English, and they will often get offended if you asked to be spoken in English. And the next one is that Chinese is great for business and for your resume. And so over the last maybe 35 years, China has transformed itself to arguably become one of the largest world economies. In fact, China's economy is currently the second largest in the world, according to nominal GDP, representing about, if I remember correctly, 16.30% of the entire global economy. And as an interesting fact, China was also the only major economy to get through the turbulent year of 2020 with an actual increase in GDP. And so with Chinese language skills, you will be able to navigate the vast global Chinese linguistic community to meet new business partners, clients, and customers. And while new business connections are invaluable, there are some other perks to knowing Chinese, especially if you're already doing or if you would like to do business in China. So you can run a business, hold meetings, attend conferences like without intermediaries like translators. And you can also directly access the knowledge and information provided in Chinese language websites, newspapers, TV programs, and books. So you would give yourself an advantage to these critical resources to plan for your next moves. And so through learning Chinese, you can basically transform yourself into somebody invaluable to the success of a project or Chinese company. And so you can make yourself stand out from the crowd. So now some interesting facts. First of all, the word Mandarin does not exist in Chinese, and some Chinese speakers may consider it offensive. Just so you know, in the English language and maybe in Spanish and in Portuguese as well, it is an official word, but in Chinese it's not. And so the official language in China is called Putonghua, which means the tongue of the people of Putong, which is the original place of where the Chinese people were originated from. And also this Putonghua is also known as Hanyu, which means language of the Han people, which is the ethnicity of the Chinese people or the main ethnicity of the Chinese people. Or it is simply also known as Zhongwen, which means just Chinese, or literally language from the center. And so for reference, why it is called language of the center, it's because China in Chinese is called 中国, which translates as Middle Kingdom or center country, as the Chinese believe their country to be located in the center of the world. And so the word Mandarin, therefore, does not exist in the Chinese language and was in fact invented by the British. And there are two theories as to why this came to be. The first one is that when the British arrived in China, they saw that the Ming Dynasty officials were yellow robes, similar in color to the mandarin fruit. And so they started calling them Mandarin people and their language Mandarin. And the second theory is that also when the British arrived to China, it was too difficult for them to pronounce the official name of the language, Putonghua. And so they began calling it the mandating language, or Mandarin, as it was the tongue that was spoken in the capital or from the place where people mandated. And so that's where it came from. So I will therefore try to avoid using the word Mandarin to refer to the official Chinese language and simply call it Chinese. All other dialects have their own name, which we will see in the next point. And so there are hundreds of Chinese dialects. Officially, there are 10 major branches of Chinese, out of which hundreds of varieties exist. In Chinese, they are referred to as Hanyu, Fangyan, or Chinese dialects. And note that linguistics consider many of these dialects to be separate languages. Within mainland China, however, it is politically correct to refer to the various varieties of Chinese as dialects, even though the difference between these variants and the standard or official Chinese is greater than the difference between most European languages. And so here we have a list of those 10 varieties or branches, starting with the standard Chinese, which is spoken by about 73% of the population. And then we can see the rest and the percentage here in this little chart. You can see what percentage they represent or what percentage of the population speaks this language. And so we have the Ming Chinese, Wu Chinese, or Shanghainese, Cantonese, Jin Chinese, Gan Chinese, Hakka Chinese, or Gejia, Xiang Chinese, Huizhou Chinese, and Pinhua, and other unclassified dialects. So that is for dialects. And so now let's move on to why Chinese is not as hard as you think. And so first of all, one of the most common reactions people have when you suggest they learn Chinese is to complain that it is incredibly difficult. Luckily for Chinese learners, this is completely wrong. While there are probably easier languages to learn than Chinese, it is by no means the most difficult. And so why do people think Chinese is difficult? First of all, for a number of reasons. Chinese has developed this misconception or reputation for difficulty. Among the most common reasons is the strange nature of its writing system and the pronunciation, which includes 4 tones plus a neutral tone. And we will study these 2 areas in more detail in the following section, but let me briefly explain what this means. Unlike most languages which use phonetic writing, Chinese is made of pictograms and semi-phonetic ideograms. So what does this mean? Okay, so a phonetic system is one in which a letter represents a sound. For example, the letter A has the sound A or A. And when you look at a word in phonetic language, you can read it aloud by simply sounding out the letters. For example, the word tree that we have here, right? Even if you don't know what the word tree means, you can sound it out and know how it is pronounced by simply knowing the phonetics. T-R-E, tree, right? And it happens, the same thing happens with other phonetic languages like Portuguese and Spanish. However, in a pictographic system, on the other hand, you can do this because each symbol or character represents an image or word. For example, this one over here. When you see this Chinese character, you can see it resembles a tree, and so that's what it means. It means tree, even if you don't know how it is pronounced, right? And in fact, you don't know how it is pronounced by just looking at it. But Chinese people, when they look at it, at the image, they immediately know it represents a tree. And so that is the difference. And in terms of pronunciation, Chinese has 4 tones plus a neutral tone. And depending on what tone you use, the meaning of the word will change. And so, for example, this we have here, ma with the first tone, it means mother. Ma with the second tone, it means hemp or fiber. Ma with the third tone, it means horse. And ma with the fourth tone, it means to scold or to curse. And so depending on the accent or the tone that you use, the meaning will change. So you need to be very careful on the pronunciation. And so you may initially think that this is incredibly difficult. However, the good news is that there are probably more, I would say that is the hardest about Chinese. And so people often assume that all other elements of the language are equally difficult, when in reality, this is not the case. Chinese may look difficult, but if you compare it to a language like, I don't know, Finnish, which doesn't appear too intimidating until you discover it is one of the most grammatically complex languages on earth. It is incredibly hard. So in that sense, Chinese is not too difficult. In fact, when it comes to the use of grammatical tenses, Chinese is really one of the easiest languages there is to learn, because unlike most European languages, it does not feature complicated construct-like cases and genders, and it also treats tenses in a very simplistic way. For example, here we have a sentence, I ate pizza yesterday. So how do we say that in Chinese? 我昨天吃了披萨. And this, if we translate it directly, if we don't use translation rules, but translate directly word by word, it would mean I, yesterday, eat, a past tense that it's a particle that we use for every past tense. So we just include le to indicate past, and then pizza. And so that is how simple it is. There's no tenses, like no future, no past. For that, we only use one particle, and that's it. Of course, there are some particularities of where to put the adverbs or the adjectives, but that's about it. We don't have to worry like in other languages, especially Spanish and French. I don't know about Portuguese, but maybe it's the same. So in that regard, Chinese is really easy. Furthermore, unlike other East Asian languages such as Korean and Japanese, the language is free from complicated honorific grammar. And so maybe you don't know this, but in Japanese and in Korean, they have another, besides the usual casual way, they have another more polite language that it's basically like another language. So you need to learn Japanese, and the more polite language or Japanese called keigo. And that is incredibly difficult. Chinese doesn't have that, so that's a good thing. And even the difficulty of the characters and tones is exaggerated. A final point to be made here about Mandarin or official Chinese, I know I said not to say Mandarin, but so you know, is that even the difficulty of its hardest part, the characters and the tones, is exaggerated. And people will often dismiss Chinese by saying things like, won't I have to learn 10,000 random pictures, or doesn't every word have like 10 meanings? Well, the truth is that the characters are not random pictures, but a reasonably organized system of radicals and phonetic elements that it isn't too hard to understand and to memorize. In addition, a learner really only needs to know about 2,000 to 3,000 characters to have a reasonable degree of fluency. With respect to the tones, while important, they are not necessarily critical to understanding, because in actuality, Chinese people tend to use context more than the tone to understand what you're talking about in any given situation. And finally, a trick here, you can write in pinyin in your smartphone and computer. So you don't have to learn to write. And so nowadays, most people only write in pinyin. Pinyin, if you don't know, it's the standard system of romanized spelling for translating Chinese. So for example, here we have this little picture, and you can see here are the Chinese characters for ni hao or hello. And if you write NIHAO, you can have the character. So you basically only need to recognize the characters to be able to write them in your phone. Fun story, my stepfather, who is actually a successful businessman and only speaks Chinese, no English, no Spanish, he barely knows how to write, like at all. He doesn't know how to type most words. He doesn't know how to write. He only communicates through phone, and he's still a successful businessman. So you really don't need to learn too much on how to write. So that's a good thing. And so moving on, now we can finally study some of the Chinese basics, okay? So in this part, we will see the writing system, the phonetics and the pronunciation, the tones, and at the end, we will study some dialects that we can practice together. So let's begin with the writing system or radicals. Okay, so here we have a picture with, let me see, it's 8 Chinese characters, right? And so when you look at them, of course, they have little pictures here to identify what they mean. But if you notice, they are very similar to pictograms, right? And so each image, that's what they represent. So without me telling you, you can guess what their meanings are. And if you pay attention, you actually can see that they do resemble a little bit these things. Of course, throughout the centuries, the language has evolved and has been simplified so that it is easier to remember and write all the characters. The original pictograms, however, were much different and did resemble these things a little bit more closely. And so, for example, here we have the meanings, right? As you expected, the first one means fire. And why does it mean fire? Well, the story is that, for example, if we look at the one below, we have the person, right? And you can see that it actually looks like a person, right? Here we have the legs. And so the way I learned fire, for example, is that it is a person with its arms raised as if it was escaping from the fire. And so that's the image that you have to form in your head to understand or to learn the Chinese characters. And even though these are actual Chinese characters that have these meanings, mostly by themselves do not mean anything. They are combined with others similar to these to make words. And so that's why they're called radicals. Because when you combine one radical with another radical, you combine a word or you make a word. And we will see this in the next section. So let's see a video to clarify this a little bit further. Maybe, let me see if I can play it.
I think Hailan frozen.
Yes. Let's just wait a little bit.
Yeah, from Mira. Yeah.
Let me try to talk to her.
Hailan.
Hello, hello.
No, Hailan, where are you?
Please
No.
come back.
Please come back. I was learning a lot.
She's still frozen? Oh my God. This never happened before. Just a second.
It's a cliffhanger. I want to know what the bad cloud thing is.
And she's
Oh.
gone.
Yeah. Who can take over and speak Chinese now? Carol.
Someone?
No,
What does-
I don't speak
She's back.
Chinese.
There
I'm
she is.
sorry.
She's back.
She's back.
Well,
She's back.
Okay.
It literally like pushed me out.
It's fine.
You can post again the
Evil
video.
cloud.
Now, where did you leave? Sorry. Let me
Just go from the video again.
Oh, okay. So from the video.
That cloud was really evil.
But you need to share your screen.
Yeah, one
Yeah.
second, please. 1 second. Okay, here we have it, right? Maybe it's because it started raining, so maybe that's why. But we'll see. So let's move on here a little bit. And let me know if you can still see it.
Yep.
And so that's basically how we learn Chinese, or the Chinese characters. We think of an image. For example, here it's the little bird walking, and that means to walk, right? And so that's exactly how we learn it. Let me see. How do I get out of this? Okay. And so, of course, these are more complicated than the ones we saw before. These are more abstract, but it's still the same idea. Okay. So how are Chinese characters formed? Now that we saw how the radicals represent images, how are the actual Chinese characters formed? So by now, we know that this character means tree, correct? You don't need to remember what it is called in Chinese. In fact, I haven't told you what it is called in Chinese, but you only need to know that it is a tree. And probably you already know that it is a tree because we saw it twice. And so what happens if we combine this tree with two more trees? Okay, so to form this character, well, we make a forest because it's a combination of trees. And so that's basically what this character means, forest. And you can see that obviously this is a very clear image of 3 trees, and that's how all of their characters are formed. Of course, there are more abstract ones. And in fact, we can apply this idea to other concepts. For example, we saw before that the first one, this character, means sun, and the second one means moon. So what happens if we combine these two? Any ideas of what might it mean, or what might it represent? Yes or no?
Somebody say the eclipse,
The what?
like an eclipse, like a moon eclipse, or
Maybe,
It's
maybe.
like a
That might be right. It's that kind of idea.
A mirror.
Buildings.
Maybe, right? That kind of idea. In fact, this means brightness, right? Because there's nothing brighter than a sun and a moon. And you can actually use this character for all those meanings, right? That have the word brightness or the idea of brightness embedded on them. And actually, this character also means righteousness or justice because it comes from that same idea of brightness, right? Righteousness or justice, it's pure, it's bright, it's all that. So that's how we form more abstract concepts. Similarly, we can do the same with even more complex and abstract concepts to form actual words or compound words. For example, this character over here means idea or thought. And it is formed with the characters for sound and heart. Okay, in fact, sound is also a compound character because it has the character for standing up and the one for sun. Because when you hear your alarm in the early morning, you know, when you're going to stand up with the sun, you hear that sound to make yourself stand up. And so this character has these two characters combined, the one for sound and the one for heart. So the story that I use to remember this character is that you hear the sound of your beating heart as you concentrate deeply on an idea. Has that ever happened to you? Maybe like you're really concentrating on something and you're meditating, and so you start hearing the sound of your heartbeat. Well, that's the idea of this character. That's what it means, or why it was formed like this, to mean idea or thought. And then we have this other one that means to consider, to think, or to ponder. And it is similarly made with the characters for brain and the character for heart. And the story that I use is that a brain it's a brain carefully thinking about something and not letting the emotions from the heart control its actions. And so that's how I remember that this character, brain plus heart, means to think. And so we combine these two to form an actual word or a compound word. It becomes meaning. So you think an idea to understand the meaning of something. And that's how what this is meaning. And even if you don't know what or how it is pronounced in Chinese, you can easily identify, okay, so if you see these two characters together, you immediately know that this is meaning. If we put another word before, maybe it will mean something different. For example, this in Chinese is called 意思, which is meaning. But if you put another word before, 有意思 means interesting. So that's how we start combining characters with characters to form stories and then to give them another type of meaning. And yeah, so that's relatively easy to remember, or easier to remember than if you had to, like just see this character and with no context, remember that it means idea or that it means to think or that these two combined means meaning. And now for the Chinese phonetics and pronunciation. Here we have a list of all the Chinese phonetic words. There are no more. So if you learn this table, you can already know all the words that exist in the Chinese language. Of course, like I said, depending on the tone, the meaning will change. And you have to memorize what each of these with a certain tone means. Of course, we won't do that in this session. However, I would like to teach you some of the difficult sounds in Chinese. For example, these you will see a lot, okay? The difference between the soft sounds and the hard sounds. In Chinese, these two words, or these two letters, sorry, they sound the same. The D and the T both sound t, like a T. They actually sound the same as how they would sound in English with the hard sound, with the hard tone, sorry, or the hard sound, right? So the D will sound T, and the G will sound K, and the P will sound P, right? And so, knowing that there's no difference between the two, how can you identify that there's a difference? Well, the difference is in the soft versus the hard sounds, okay? So when we say the D, for example, let's see here, one word, for example, da, right? Or di. Di works better because we have that company called Didi, right? Didi is a company, a Chinese company that we already know. And so Didi is actually pronounced with a T, T, okay? Didi. And the T, it's with a hard sound, with a lot of air. T. So Didi with no air coming out, and the T is with a lot of air coming out. T. So you can repeat after me if you like to. If not, you can just hear me out. Okay, so Didi and T. Same with the G and the K. Ka, or ke, or gu, and ku, or ka. Okay, so that's the difference between G and K. One is soft, one is hard, similar with B and with P. Okay, papa is with B, and then with P is papa. So a lot of air coming out, If you have questions, feel free to interrupt me. But that's the difference between this. And I've seen that a lot of Chinese learners, when they are starting to learn Chinese, this is one of the hardest things for them to understand, that there is a difference between these two sounds, and it's not the same as most of the European languages. And then we have the other rest of the difficult sounds. The Q, for example, it's easy because you only need to remember that it sounds like CH, ch. So, for example, QI is qi. Or like we have here at the bottom of this table, qi, qia, qiao, qie, qu. Okay, so the Q, it's CH. Then the J means or sounds like a Y. So j, for example, jue, ji, all of those, right? It sounds exactly like a Y in English. And the X has two sounds. It can either sound SH or S. So for example, to say thank you, you can say 谢谢 or 谢谢. Both are correct because in pinyin is written with an X. And finally, the most difficult ones for every non-Chinese or Asian native speaker for any Asian language is the Z, the C, and the S. Those are incredibly difficult to get correctly or to manage. In fact, for me, this is still a problem to pronounce. Also, with their variants with ZH, CH, and SH. So for example, there's only a very small difference between the two, but of course the Chinese people can identify it. So the S is very clear because it sounds like an S. For example, sa or sai. But if you want to say that with Z or with C, the Z, so the first one, the Z letter or Z, you have to say sai. If you want to say it with C, it's tai. And maybe you cannot even hear what the difference is, but there's a small difference. What I've identified that the difference is that the Z, it's with a closer mouth, tai, and the C, it's with a more open mouth, sai. That's the only difference. And Chinese people can tell you if you're saying it correctly, but otherwise, it's almost impossible to identify. So questions about this? Nope, perfect. So let's move on to the Chinese towns. Like I mentioned before, there are 4 towns plus a neutral tone. And these towns are indicated above every vowel. So what does this mean? Okay, so here we have the 4 main towns plus a neutral one. The neutral one is really easy. So let's focus on the main 4, right? Each of them have a different pitch or sound. The first one is higher, and it sounds ah, ah, ah. The second one, it's going from below and going up. Okay, so ah, ah, ah. This third one is similar to the second one. In fact, these two are very, very similar. The only difference is that the third one first goes down and then goes up. Ah. So if you're making a curve, ah, ah. And the fourth one, it's very easy. Ah. So it's just like a very hard accent, very similar to the one in Spanish. I don't know if Portuguese has that one, but maybe it does. So it's ah, ah. And the neutral one is just ah. Right? No tone whatsoever, just ah. Okay, so let's practice more with actually the words that we have been seeing, which was ma. So let's practice this, and you can repeat after me if you like to. So first one is ma, very flat. Ma, ma. Second one, going up, ma, ma, ma. Third one, first down, then up. Ma, ma, ma. Fourth one, very easy, going down really hard. Ma, ma, ma. And finally, the last one, ma, just ma. No tone whatsoever, no intonation, no high pitch, just ma. And we already saw what the difference of these 4 are, right? In terms of meaning, right? The first one means mother, the second one means fiver or hump, third one means horse, and fourth one means to scold. The neutral one is really, really important because it represents a question mark. In Chinese, when you make a question, you have to put at the end that you're saying a question. So every question you have to end with ma to identify that you're making a question. Unlike in our languages that you have to make that intonation like Here, no, you have to say ma. And the reason why they do that is because that intonation of the question that we do cannot be done in Chinese because it could be misunderstood or misheard with the other tones. So that's why they don't do that. And instead, they have a word to represent that that's a question. And so, like we mentioned before, every phoneme changes in meaning depending on the tone. However, it is possible for two completely different words to have the same tone and a different meaning, depending on how it is written. And so, for example, here we have another word that is also ma, but it has a completely different character. As you can see, these are two completely different characters. They're nothing alike, and they have a different meaning, but they are both pronounced ma with the fourth tone. And so in this case, people will know you're talking about one or the other, depending on the context. So now let's move on to the practice. Very good. So let me see. Let's practice the first dialogue. And in this part, I will start analyzing the dialogue and explaining the dialogue a little bit. And then maybe I can ask for some volunteers for you to act out this dialogue. Okay? So the first dialogue goes, 你好, or hello. 你好, right? You can see here, written in pinyin. And above every vowel, you can see what tone it represents. And of course, you can see later on how it is actually written in, in Chinese. But let's focus on the pinyin for now. 你好, hello, right? Then B says 你好. 你好吗? Like we saw before, the ma represents the question mark. And so this means how are you? 你好吗? It's how are you? And you can also, and then you can say, oh, I'm good or I'm bad. Of course, we want to say that we are good, right? So we say 我很好, 我很好. I'm very good. 我很好，你呢 ？And you？ 我很好，你呢？我也很好。I also very good. 我也很好。I think you can still hear me? Yes? Okay, perfect. So that's dialogue number one. Let's review dialogue number two so we can practice both of them together. Okay. So the second one, it's to introduce your name. Okay. So how do you introduce your name in an easy way? 我, it means I. 叫, it's name, or you can say name, or it's actually named, like the verb to be named, but it's understandable. 我叫, and then you put your name. 我叫海兰，你呢? And you? And then you reply 我叫 and your name. And then optional, if you want to continue practicing more, you can say 认识你很高兴, which means nice to meet you. 认识你很高兴. Okay? So you can say that too if you want. If not, just up to dialogue 2. Okay? So who wants to go first?
Fernanda.
I am the last person to be called upon.
Yeah,
let's pick someone else.
She speaks Chinese, so she can practice too.
Yeah, I can go. Let's go.
Okay, so 你好，
你好，
你好吗？
我很好，你呢？
我也很好。我叫海伦，你呢？
我叫 Fernanda。
认识你很高兴。
我也认识你很高兴。
Perfect. Very good. Of course, Fernanda already knows a little bit of Chinese, but this is basically it, right? So this is basically it. So who wants to go next to practice a little bit so you can impress your Chinese friends? Come on, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. If not, I'm gonna be starting calling names. So Miguel, why are you laughing? Why are you laughing? Let's go.
I'm signing documents and your contracts, but okay.
Let's go. 你好。
你好。
你好吗？
我很好，你呢？
Again, 我
我
很
很
好，
好，
你呢？
你呢？
我也很好，我叫海兰，你呢
我叫 Miguel。
？Perfect. 认识你很高兴。Excellent. Very, very good, Miguel. Who wants to go next? Hugo, let's go.
I can have a try.
Okay. 你好，
你好，
你好吗？
我很好，你呢？
你呢
你呢？
？Perfect. 我也很好，我叫海兰，你呢？
我叫 Hugo，你呢？
我叫海兰。Perfect. 认识你很高兴。Excellent. Very, very good. So, someone else. Caro, you wanted to practice. Let's go.
Hailan, no. Okay.
Of course.
Okay. Let's do it.
你好
But you will guide me, okay?
Of course.
你好，
你好吗？
我很好，你呢？
我
我
很
很
好。
好，你
你
呢？
呢？你呢
你呢？
？Again, 我很好。你呢？
我很好，你呢？
你呢
你呢？
？Perfect. Very good. 我也很好。我叫海兰。你呢？
我好。
Nope. This one.
我好。
我
叫 Caro。
Perfect.
你呢？
Very, very good.
Okay, great.
Yeah, excellent. So again, 我叫海兰。你呢？
我要 Carolina.
Perfect. Very, very good. 认识你很高兴。Perfect.
Okay, good.
Okay. Very, very good. Okay. Someone else, and then we can move to the questions. Last one. Who wants to go?
Javier.
Javier.
Okay.
Okay. So 你好，
你好，
你好吗？
我很好，你呢？
Perfect. 我很好。你呢？Repeat.
我也很好，
我很好。
我也很好。
Perfect. Very good. 我叫海兰。你呢？
我叫 Javier。
Excellent. 认识你很高兴。That's it. See, it's of course the pronunciation is a little bit difficult at the beginning, but you can see that the grammar is actually very, very easy, right? And this is about it. So Chinese in that regard is not that complicated. So I think that would be it. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask them about anything related.
So if we want to learn more, either grammar or the basics for learning Chinese, what would you recommend?
That's a very good question. First of all, you can either get a teacher or get very good materials. There are very good materials either online or audiobooks. And so depending on what era you want to practice, so some people say, for example, that they want to only get good at speaking, right? Because they want to be good at business, and they need to get very good at speaking very quickly, and they don't care too much about their writing or their reading aspect. But some other people say, oh, I do want to get involved with everything about the language, and I do want to learn how the characters work. In that regard, those would be two separate areas. But for the business side, there are very, very good audiobooks and material that you can get. Of course, if you have someone who can guide you or that you can hear the pronunciation from, that would be great. If not, actually from the book or just like hearing how it's pronounced on the recordings, that would be like still very good. And you can, unlike many other languages, you can actually get relatively fluent in Chinese very fast. Not at the level that you would be considered, like you can speak with every Chinese partner, but at least you can get by in China. In like maybe like 6 months, you can like get you can be by yourself in China with no one to translate for you. So at the beginning, it's actually very easy. Later on, it's really hard. And so I hope that answers your question. I have another question here. How long have you been studying Chinese? Actually, that is a funny question to answer. My family is Chinese. So of course I have been in contact with the language for a very long time. And I do speak with my family casually in Chinese, but like at a high level, I had never studied Chinese before. And I actually started studying Chinese very recently, like maybe like 3 years ago. And so mostly it's that, like I wasn't very good at Chinese before, only like the casual. Yeah. So I grew up listening to it at home, but it's not the same. Even now, my family says that my pronunciation is terrible. And they make fun of me, especially with certain words. But I also make fun of my mom when she speaks Spanish. So that's fair.
Do you recommend us to listen, like, for example, like music, like pop or like K-pop or something like that in order like to get familiar with the sounds, or probably that wouldn't be the best decision to make?
I love that question because people who teach languages, but they are not teachers. There are two types of people who will teach you a language. Those who speak the language very, very well, and so they think they can teach only because they speak the language. And those who actually know how to teach the language, even if they are not, maybe they are not perfect at the language, but they know how to teach. If you have to choose between those two, always go with the one who knows how to teach. It's better, even if they are not really good at speaking the language, or they are not at an excellent level, or they are not native speakers. If they have experience teaching, or they have studied how to teach, that is better. And studies say, or people who actually make the materials and study how people learn, they recommend not to listen to music or watch movies when you are at a low or at a basic level, because what happens is that you will only learn or understand the things or the knowledge that is a little bit above what you already know. So if you start listening to music right now, you won't know or understand anything. Even with the sounds, you won't even get familiar with it. You would have to do that for years, maybe like 10 years for it to actually start working. And so I don't actually recommend that. At the beginning, you need to start, actually knowing some of the basics. And later on, you can actually, start listening to music, watching some movies, or there are some very, very good shows that are in Chinese on Netflix. Like, I totally recommend those. Are really, really good. And by the way, BTS is Korean. So
yeah, now I noticed that. Fair enough. Okay, we'll try to do that as well. Thanks, Hailan.
Yeah, so for any language, that applies to any language. So if you're trying to learn French or even English or Spanish, don't do that. Like people say, oh, watch a lot of things. That's not recommended unless you're already at a certain level.